Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight. You have probably heard that Donald Trump has re-entered the White House, that Iran remains the great antagonist of American foreign policy, and that Middle Eastern conflict continues to simmer at the border between containment and conflagration. But here is the part most people are missing. The Trump administration is not merely preparing to confront Iran. It is architecting a fundamental reordering of great power competition that will not be resolved in the Middle East at all. The real winner of the next 3 years is already written into the structural logic of what Trump is about to do. And I want to show you tonight what that hidden architecture looks like, because once you see it, you will understand why the mainstream coverage of Trump and Tehran has gotten the question almost entirely backwards. The public story, as it is told in the cable news cycle, runs like this. Trump will increase pressure on Iran through sanctions and military posturing. Iran will respond through its proxy network in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. Perhaps there will be an escalation. Perhaps there will be a negotiation. It is a headline-level frame that treats the U.S.-Iran standoff as a bilateral relationship contained within the Middle East. But that frame is incomplete, and it misses the real gambit entirely. What is actually unfolding is a three-layered strategy that positions the United States for a generational advantage against a very different adversary than Iran. And to understand that adversary, you have to pull the lens back from the Middle East and ask yourself one question that almost nobody in Washington is asking right now. What does Iran's weakness between now and 2027 mean for China? That is not accidental. That is the hidden structural logic. Let me explain it carefully, layer by layer. The first layer is tactical containment. Trump will indeed increase pressure on Iran. New sanctions, designation of the Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, possibly selective strikes on strategic facilities if red lines are crossed. This is the visible move, the one the press covers, the one that occupies the diplomatic calendar. But tactical containment of Iran is not the primary objective. It is the cover for the primary objective. The second layer is regional realignment. What Trump is actually constructing right now, through both carrot and stick, is a Sunni-led coalition that runs from the Levant through the Gulf and extends into the Indian Ocean. This is not a new idea, but it is now being woven together with historical precision. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Israel, and increasingly Turkey, with arms deals, security guarantees, and intelligence sharing arrangements, are being consolidated into what you might call a Western-aligned regional architecture. Iran, by contrast, is being systematically isolated. Its oil is cut off from global markets. Its currency is collapsing. Its economy is contracting at roughly 4.8% annually as of late 2024. The message to Iran is clear. You can either accept a subordinate position in a regional system dominated by American allies, or you can face perpetual crisis. That choice, in other words, is Iran's immediate horizon. But here is where we must go one level deeper. Because the tactical move against Iran is not really about Iran at all. It is about Beijing. The third layer, the one that changes everything, is great power positioning. Iran has been China's most important strategic asset in the Middle East for the past 15 years. When China signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Iran in March 2021, a $400 billion framework covering investment, energy, and military cooperation, it was not signing a conventional trade deal. It was positioning itself as the great power sponsor of the only state in the region willing to be openly hostile to American interests. That partnership gave China leverage over a critical corridor, the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 21% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes daily. It gave China a counterweight against American naval dominance in the Indian Ocean. And it gave China a forward position in what strategists call the Greater Middle East, which is beginning to matter far more to Beijing than it ever mattered to Washington. Trump understands this. His administration is not fighting Iran to protect American interests in the Middle East. It is fighting Iran to dismantle China's only reliable state ally in the region. and to do so before the strategic relationship between China and Iran deepens further. Now look carefully at the timing. The 25-year agreement was signed in March 2021. It is scheduled to mature into its most consequential phase: full arms transfers, integrated military command, the real enforcement of security guarantees. Between 2026 and 2030, Trump will be president during the exact window in which that partnership should reach operational capacity. If he can cripple Iran economically and diplomatically between now and early 2027, he will have interrupted that transition at the most vulnerable moment. China will have a partner on paper, but not on the ground. And the entire strategic architecture of Chinese influence in the Middle East collapses. That is the logic. And that is why Iran's weakness is not the end game. It is the entry point to something far larger. Now let us examine the historical pattern that confirms this reading. Look carefully at how American power has historically managed regional competition with its great power rivals. During the Cold War, the United States did not contain Soviet power by fighting Soviet infantry in proxy wars, though it did some of that. What the United States actually did was contain Soviet power by consolidating Allied networks in critical regions and by strangling Soviet client states through economic siege. The Shah's Iran was tilted toward the West, Soviet proxies in Afghanistan were contested, and Soviet allies in the Middle East were systematically isolated or co-opted. The architecture of American dominance in the region outlasted the Soviet Union itself. We see the same pattern in the Taiwan Strait during the 1950s and 1960s. The United States did not win by invading mainland China. It won by making sure that American allies on Taiwan and Japan became so much more prosperous and militarily capable than the alternatives that the strategic calculus shifted permanently in Washington's favor. Now we are seeing that same pattern being deployed against China, but with a different mechanism. Trump is consolidating a Sunni regional order precisely because that order is hostile to Chinese influence. He is cutting Iran off from its energy revenues precisely because energy revenues are what would allow Iran to become the credible military and economic platform that China's 25-year strategy requires. He is positioning Saudi Arabia and the UAE as the hubs of economic growth in the Middle East, precisely because those states are now betting their futures on alignment with the West, not with Beijing. This is not new strategy. It is the oldest strategy in the playbook of great power competition. And it is being executed with what you might call brutal clarity. The fourth layer requires us to understand the consequences that flow from this strategic logic. If the Trump administration succeeds in its regional realignment, and I should emphasize this is a substantial if, then Iran becomes what we might call a contained power. By 2027 or 2028, Iran's economy will be in deeper crisis. Its proxies in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen will be weakened by lack of financial support from Tehran. Its navy will age without replacement parts or credible modernization. Most critically, Iran will no longer be able to serve as China's forward position in great power competition. Instead, Iran will be competing for scraps of support from Beijing, which will have moved on to seek other partnerships and mechanisms of influence. China's Belt and Road Initiative in the Middle East will have stalled, Chinese investment in the region will contract, and the calculus of states in the Sunni Middle East will shift decisively. They will see Beijing not as a rising force that must be accommodated, but as a declining priority, as someone who lost its regional champion. This has cascading implications. If Iran cannot serve as the anchor of Chinese influence in the Middle East, then China must look elsewhere for strategic depth in the Indo-Pacific. It will intensify its focus on Pakistan, on Southeast Asia, on the maritime choke points it can actually control. And this creates a second, almost unspoken strategic environment, a competition over the global energy market and the corridors through which it flows. Saudi Arabia becomes more important to energy security than it has been in decades. The UAE becomes a critical node in global finance and insurance. The question of who controls energy futures, not just Middle Eastern oil, but global liquefied natural gas supply, critical minerals, rare earth processing, becomes the central nervous system of great power competition. And the Trump administration is positioning itself not merely to contain Iran, but to dominate the control of those flows. But here is where the strategy becomes truly dangerous. And this is the part I want to emphasize carefully. The assumption built into all of this is that China will accept a diminished role in the Middle East without escalation elsewhere. And that assumption may be false. Let me walk you through the scenario logic. We are currently looking at three distinct outcomes, each with very different implications for the world order. In the first scenario, which we might call successful containment, the Trump administration achieves its regional realignment by 2026. Iran's economy continues to contract. The Sunni coalition holds. Saudi Arabia and Israel deepen their security integration. The UAE becomes the financial heart of the Middle East, pumping dollars into Asia, but keeping its strategic orientation firmly with the West. In this scenario, China faces a choice. It can accept the loss of Iran as a strategic asset and pivot entirely to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, or it can attempt a compensatory move in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. Given that Trump has also signaled a more confrontational posture toward Chinese economic dominance, this scenario actually increases the risk of great power confrontation elsewhere. The Middle East becomes less volatile, but the global system becomes more brittle. In the second scenario, which we might call regional escalation, Iran refuses to accept containment. Between now and 2027, Iran increases support for its proxy network in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. It potentially moves to a nuclear weapons program with greater urgency. It attacks American interests or Israeli interests or both. The Trump administration, seeing an existential threat to its regional architecture, responds with military force. This could be a limited strike campaign, airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or Revolutionary Guard bases, or it could escalate to something more comprehensive. In this scenario, oil prices spike, global growth decelerates, the regional architecture fractures rather than consolidates. And China gains space to move in the Middle East through humanitarian aid and reconstruction finance, exactly the way it moved into Iraq and Afghanistan when American attention and resources were tied up in prolonged conflict. In the third scenario, which is the one that worries strategic planners the most, we might call it bifurcated competition. The Trump administration partially succeeds in containing Iran, but not completely. Iran remains weakened, but not broken. Meanwhile, China, seeing that the Middle East is being closed to it, makes a comprehensive strategic move elsewhere. It accelerates military modernization in the Taiwan Strait. It intensifies pressure on the Philippines and Vietnam over the South China Sea. It consolidates control over critical supply chains for rare earth elements and semiconductor manufacturing. In other words, China accepts the loss of Iran as a strategic base and instead doubles down on the only region where it can actually challenge American power directly, the Western Pacific. This scenario puts Trump in the position of having won a regional victory in the Middle East while losing ground in the theater that actually matters most for American security. Now let us examine what those scenarios actually look like in terms of concrete developments we should expect to see over the next 24 months. In the first quarter of 2025, watch for three specific moves. First, the Trump administration will issue new sanctions designations against Iran's oil sector, targeting the remaining Chinese buyers and the intermediaries who help them evade American controls. These will be comprehensive sanctions, not surgical ones. Second, the administration will complete new security agreements with Saudi Arabia and Israel that formalize defense cooperation and potentially position American military assets in the region for rapid deployment against Iran. These agreements will include language about threats to regional stability, which is diplomatic code for Iran. And third, watch the behavior of the UAE. If the UAE is truly pivoting away from its hedging strategy, where it maintained diplomatic channels to both Washington and Beijing, and moving toward alignment with Israel and Saudi Arabia, you will see it in reduced Chinese investment approvals, in statements about regional stability, and in intelligence cooperation arrangements. By the second quarter of 2025, watch for Iran's response. If Iran is going to escalate, it will do so in Syria and Iraq first, before the military pressure in the Gulf becomes unbearable. Iranian-backed militias will move against American positions or Israeli positions in Iraq. The Syrian government, already on the verge of state collapse, will either fragment further or be consolidated under a new authority that is hostile to Iranian influence. If you see the Syrian government fracturing, that is a signal that the Sunni regional realignment is working. If you see it consolidating under Iranian or Russian influence, that is a signal that Iran is preparing for a longer standoff. By the third quarter of 2025, the crucial test will be energy markets. If Trump's strategy is working, OPEC Plus will face a choice. Does it maintain production cuts that keep oil prices elevated and support a Saudi-led regional order, or does it increase production and destroy margins to maintain Chinese friendship? The answer to that question tells you whether the Sunni coalition actually holds or whether it is fragmenting under market pressure. Oil above $80 a barrel suggests the coalition holds. Oil below $60 a barrel suggests it is breaking apart. By the fourth quarter of 2025 and into early 2026, we will see either Chinese escalation or Chinese accommodation. If China has accepted the loss of Iran as a strategic asset, you will see increased Chinese engagement with Middle Eastern states beyond Iran. More investment in Egypt, more ports in Oman and Yemen, more integrations with the Gulf Cooperation Council states. If China is planning compensatory moves elsewhere, you will instead see a quiet buildup in the Taiwan Strait, accelerated military exercises with Russia, and signals of indifference toward Middle Eastern developments. The location of Chinese attention will tell us which strategic scenario we are actually in. The final indicator will come in late 2026 and into 2027. At that point, we will see whether the Sunni coalition has actually consolidated into what we might call a functioning strategic arrangement, or whether it has remained a collection of bilateral relationships without structural depth. If you see the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt beginning to conduct joint military exercises, conducting genuine intelligence fusion, and positioning their economies as integrated rather than competitive, then the architecture holds. If instead you see them jostling for advantage, competing over American security guarantees, and maintaining the hedging strategies they have kept for decades, then the arrangement is still fragile. All of this brings us to the larger meaning of this moment and why I think this matters for the way you should think about the world order. We are living through a profound transition in how great power competition actually works. It is no longer primarily about ideology. It is not about democracy versus authoritarianism in any simple sense. It is about which great power can control the network of states and supply chains and energy corridors that will define economic and military capacity for the next 20 years. Iran is important not because Iran is a threat to American power in itself. Iran is important because it is the hinge upon which Chinese influence in the Middle East swings. And the Trump administration understands that even if it frames it in the language of confronting terrorism or Iranian nuclear ambitions, this is the pattern we should expect to see repeated across other regions. Trump's confrontation with China over trade and technology is following a similar logic. It is not really about trade balances in any conventional sense. It is about whether China can maintain access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing and artificial intelligence development in the way it has accessed it through globalized supply chains. The logic is the same. Isolate the competitor's economic base, consolidate allied networks, dominate the critical infrastructures, and let the regional consequences take care of themselves. But here is the warning that I think matters most. This strategy works only if American allies remain convinced that alignment with Washington is more valuable than hedging or switching sides. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, Turkey, they are all watching to see whether the American commitment is real and durable, or whether Trump will withdraw after a single term if events shift or costs rise. If they conclude it is the latter, if they decide that hedging toward China or Russia makes more sense than betting entirely on the United States, then the entire architecture collapses, and we will not be in a world of regional stability. We will be in a world of fractious competition where multiple great powers vie for influence in a Middle East that no longer has a dominant patron. History suggests that such moments are very dangerous. They were dangerous in the 1970s when American power receded. They were dangerous in the 1990s when Russia retreated from the region. And they will be dangerous again if the current American strategy fails to consolidate. The civilizational question underneath all of this is whether the United States can maintain the role of a global power broker in an age when its relative capacity is diminishing. Trump believes the answer is yes, and that the key is to move faster and more decisively than your rivals, to hit them in their weak points before they consolidate, to rebuild allied networks before they fragment, to dominate the infrastructure of energy and supply chains before someone else does. History will judge whether that vision is too late or precisely on time. But one thing is certain: the next 3 years in the Middle East will determine far more than the fate of Iran. They will determine whether the American-led international system survives at all, and in what form. That is the real architecture behind the headlines. If what you heard tonight made you think more carefully about how great power competition actually works, if it challenged your assumption that the Middle East matters because of oil or terrorism rather than because of strategic geometry with China, then I encourage you to subscribe. The world order is shifting in real time, and this channel is dedicated to helping you see the deeper patterns beneath the visible events. We will be tracking these developments closely, and I will return to this story as each of the indicators I mentioned begins to show itself. Drop a comment below and tell me which scenario you think is most likely. Does the Sunni coalition hold? Does China escalate elsewhere? Does the entire architecture fracture? Your intuition matters. In the comment section, we actually do something novel. We let the audience do the predictive work, and then we check back in 6 months to see who was right. That is how we move beyond opinion into actual analysis. This is one chapter of a much longer story. In the next video, we will examine the second-order consequences of American regional realignment. What happens to European power when Washington begins to consolidate the Middle East without consulting its traditional allies? Until then, thank you for listening. Let us talk soon.